Sienna had always been the type of woman who gave more than she received. At 32, she was successful, independent, and deeply generous, especially when it came to family. So when her younger sister Ava's 18th birthday was approaching, Sienna didn't hesitate to step in. She booked the elegant ballroom, paid for the 5-star catering, ordered the customized floral arrangements, and even bought the designer cake Ava had been eyeing on Instagram for months. It wasn't just about the party, it was about showing Ava that despite the distance created by their blended family, Sienna still saw her as someone worth celebrating. But 2 days before the event, everything shattered. The phone call was brief, cold, and merciless. "You're not really family, Sienna," Ava said flatly. "Please don't come, it'll just be awkward." The words hit harder than she expected. After all the money, the effort, the hope, she was dismissed like a stranger. Sienna sat in silence, heart pounding, gripping her phone with shaking fingers. This wasn't a sudden betrayal, it was the final cut after years of being slowly pushed aside. After their mother died when Sienna was just 15, her father had remarried a woman named Clarissa, who wasted no time making it clear that Sienna was an outsider in her new picture-perfect family. Ava, only 5 at the time, once adored Sienna, but years of quiet manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional distancing from Clarissa had turned Ava cold. Sienna went from big sister to afterthought. Her father, Richard, stood by, letting it all unfold, too passive or too blind to intervene. By the time Sienna turned 18, she had packed her bags and left, vowing to build a life where she didn't have to fight to be seen. Still, she'd returned for holidays, birthdays, family dinners, always hopeful that something might change. It never did, but this time was different. She wasn't going to cry or beg. She wasn't going to prove herself anymore. Instead, she picked up the phone and called the catering company. "Yes, I need to change the delivery address for Saturday's event," she said coolly. "Send everything, yes, all the food, to the Willow Grove shelter downtown." The woman on the other end hesitated, but Sienna's voice didn't waver. Every last bite, as she hung up, a calm washed over her. Not sadness, freedom. She imagined the chaos as guests arrived to a foodless party. Ava in her custom dress, smiling for photos, clueless about the unraveling disaster. Clarissa whispering furiously on her phone. Richard looking lost and useless. And when the angry calls came pouring in, Sienna ignored them all. She had already said everything she needed to say, not in words, but in action. She wasn't family? Fine, then they didn't need her generosity. The next day, while they dealt with embarrassment and empty plates, Sienna received a message from the shelter. "Thank you. Tonight, people who usually go to bed hungry had the best meal of their lives." That was all she needed. For once, what she gave was truly appreciated. Later, she logged into her bank account, staring at the untouched college fund she had planned to gift Ava. Without hesitation, she donated it to a scholarship program for girls aging out of foster care. Girls who, like her, had spent their lives trying to belong. Finally, she texted her father, "Don't ask me for anything else. I'm done trying to earn a place I never had." And just like that, Sienna closed the chapter. She wasn't angry anymore. She was done chasing love where it didn't exist. And for the first time in her life, she was free. Sienna had always known that life after 70 wasn't just about counting years. It was about the quality of the days that remained. At 74, she didn't dwell on the past as much as she once did. But certain truths had crystallized. Truths she had only begun to understand when the mirror stopped reflecting youth and started revealing stories in every wrinkle. After losing her husband 3 years earlier, she had moved into a quiet little cottage near her daughter's home, nestled between the hills and the sea. And it was in the silence of those slower days that Sienna began noticing signs, subtle, sometimes almost imperceptible, about her body, her mind, and her spirit. At first, it was the way she walked. Once brisk and confident, her steps had begun to shorten. She found herself needing to pause more often when walking through the grocery store. The decline in walking speed, she later learned, was one of the first signs doctors looked at when estimating longevity. It seemed simple, how fast you walked, but it spoke volumes about balance, muscle strength, and overall vitality. So, Sienna made a commitment. Each morning, cane in hand, she walked the path behind her house. Some days, the walk was only 10 minutes, others longer, but she never missed it, not just to defy time, but to remind herself she still had power over how her story unfolded. The next sign came in her hands, specifically, how strongly she could grip One day, she noticed she struggled to open a jar of honey. It wasn't just inconvenience, it was a red flag. Declining grip strength was a predictor of declining health. Sienna began using hand weights while she watched TV, squeezing stress balls during phone calls, doing small things every day to keep her hands from forgetting their strength. But what surprised her most wasn't the physical changes. It was how deeply everything tied to her sense of self. When she could no longer balance on one foot for more than a few seconds, she didn't just feel fragile, she felt afraid. Sienna used to dance barefoot in her living room. Now she clutched the wall while trying to put on a pair of socks. It was humbling, but instead of avoiding the challenge, she leaned in. She practiced balancing every morning after her walk, just 10 seconds at a time. One foot lifted slightly, toes wiggling. Progress came slowly, but it came. What truly changed Sienna's life, though, wasn't what she did with her body. It was how she began to treat her mind. She realized one evening, while struggling to remember the name of a neighbor, that her thoughts weren't as quick as they once were. Names slipped away like fish in water. At first, she panicked, but then she read that mental sharpness could be preserved, not just through puzzles or reading, but through relationships, sleep, and emotional regulation. That realization led her to prioritize rest. For years, she had treated sleep like an afterthought. Late nights, early mornings, caffeine, and overcommitment had been badges of productivity. Now she guarded her sleep like a precious resource. She created a bedtime routine: warm tea, soft music, no screens, no stress, and it made a difference. Her dreams returned, so did a certain clarity in her thinking. But what stood out most was how her emotions changed. Things that used to rattle her, traffic, weather, being left out of conversations, no longer did. She found herself letting go of old grudges, choosing forgiveness over bitterness. Her daughter once told her, "You've become softer, Mom." Sienna smiled. It wasn't softness, it was wisdom. She had learned that holding anger aged the soul faster than anything. Just as importantly, she began to eat with intention. Gone were the days of microwave meals or skipping lunch. Instead, Sienna filled her kitchen with foods that nourished and energized her. Fresh berries, nuts, salmon, leafy greens. Eating well wasn't about dieting. It was about survival. Her doctor called her cholesterol numbers beautiful. She laughed at that. Who would have thought cholesterol could be beautiful? And perhaps the greatest revelation of all was the power of connection. Sienna once believed independence was the ultimate goal in aging, but she learned that isolation was far more dangerous than depending on others. So she reached out. She hosted small tea gatherings, joined a walking club with other seniors, and called her grandchildren every Sunday. That human contact, those laughs, those shared stories, kept her grounded. Loneliness, she understood, was a silent killer. It eroded the will to fight. But community? It breathed life back into her. Through all of it, she came to a quiet understanding. Aging wasn't a defeat. It was an invitation to slow down and pay attention to what truly mattered. The way her body moved, the way her mind coped, the way her soul softened and expanded with grace. Sienna didn't fear death, not really. What she feared was not living fully in the years she had left. And so, each morning, she still walked. Each evening, she still balanced. She kept a gratitude journal by her bed. She wrote letters to old friends. She laughed more easily, cried more openly, and loved more fiercely. She might have been 74, but Sienna was still alive, and in so many ways, more vibrantly than ever. Because when you embrace the signs, you don't just extend life, you elevate it. Sienna had always believed that moving into a nursing home would be a peaceful decision, a place to rest, to be cared for, to finally let go of the daily burdens she carried for most of her adult life. At 78, after a fall in her garden and pressure from her two sons who lived across the country, she reluctantly agreed to transition into a senior living facility. The brochure promised independence with support, compassionate care, and a sense of community. But as the heavy wooden doors of Willow Ridge Nursing Home shut behind her, she felt something shift, something that whispered she had just surrendered more than her address. Within the first week, Sienna realized that the serene facade hid a stark reality. Her schedule was no longer her own. Meals were served at rigid times. Activities were pre-selected, and staff, though polite, seemed rushed and distant. Her autonomy, something she had cherished her entire life, was slipping away. She missed the little things first, choosing when to brew a cup of tea, listening to the radio at midnight if she couldn't sleep, sitting by the window in her robe for hours. watching the world without interruption. At Willow Ridge, those simple acts became privileges, not rights. Her room, though tidy and sunlit, didn't feel like hers. It carried the scent of bleach and silence. Photographs of her late husband and children lined the shelves, but they felt more like reminders of a life left behind than comforting mementos. The staff knocked before entering, but didn't wait for a response. Her opinions about her own care, when to bathe, what medications to try, were often overridden with the phrase, "This is standard procedure, ma'am." But perhaps the cruelest realization came when the visits from her family dwindled. In the beginning, her sons came every week, full of concern and promises. But work, distance, and life got in the way. Calls became less frequent. Holidays were marked with cards instead of hugs. Sienna began to feel like a burden more than a mother. She once sat by the front window for hours on her birthday, hoping to see her youngest son's car pull into the lot. It never did. The staff brought her a cupcake, and a nurse sang softly. But it wasn't the same. There's a kind of loneliness that settles in your bones when you realize the world you once built, home, family, memories, continues without you. She had expected physical decline with age. What she hadn't expected was how the environment would chip away at her emotional and spiritual well-being. Days blurred together, punctuated by medication rounds and forced smiles. Activities like bingo and movie nights felt like distractions, not joy. Many residents shuffled from room to room, blank-eyed and quiet, waiting for something, anything, to change. Sienna tried to make friends, but most were too tired, too guarded, or too deep in their own grief to connect. One afternoon, she spoke with an older woman named Ruth who whispered, "They call this care, but it feels like waiting to die." Those words haunted her. The worst part wasn't the loss of freedom or the loneliness. It was the slow erosion of her sense of purpose. At home, Sienna had grown tomatoes, mentored young writers at the library, and volunteered at the community center. She mattered. Here, she felt invisible. Her value seemed measured by her compliance, her health, and her quietness. Once, when she voiced concern about a change in her medication, the nurse smiled and said, "Let's leave those decisions to the professionals." That was the moment Sienna realized she was no longer seen as a thinking, feeling woman, but as a patient to be managed. And then came the moment that broke her heart. After weeks of advocating to be included in a community advisory board the facility was forming, she was told, gently but firmly, that it wasn't a good fit for residents like her. Like her, the words stung more than the rejection itself. Her thoughts weren't welcome, her voice was too loud, her desire to contribute, too inconvenient. She returned to her room that day and wept, not for herself, but for the hundreds of residents like her, once vibrant and full of life, now reduced to silence in places meant to nurture them. But Sienna wasn't ready to surrender. That night, she opened a journal and began writing, every day, documenting everything, the good, the bad, the deeply unjust. She wrote about the loneliness, the apathy, the sharp contrast between the promises made on paper and the reality inside those walls. She started sharing those pages with the only friend she had truly made, Grace, a retired schoolteacher with fire in her eyes. Grace read them aloud during their shared lunch, nodded, and added her own notes. Soon, a small circle of residents joined in. They didn't protest, they documented, quietly, consistently. By the time Sienna's son finally visited again, she handed him a manila envelope. Inside was a 40-page letter and a request. "Help me make this public," she said, "not for me, but for all of us." That small act became a ripple. The letter, shared online by her son, went viral. Journalists called, advocates reached out, state officials began asking questions. And suddenly, the residents of Willow Ridge were seen. Sienna knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but she also knew this: she had found her voice again. Even within walls meant to contain her, she found purpose, and through that purpose, she reclaimed her power, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been told to be quiet, to wait, to fade. She would not fade, she would fight, because she still mattered. Sienna was 77 when she first stepped through the double doors of Silver Pines Assisted Living, clutching a small suitcase and a heart full of uncertainty. A once fiercely independent woman who had raised 3 children, worked as a nurse for over 4 decades, and managed her household with pride. She now found herself in a place where the walls were quiet, the routines were fixed, and the faces were mostly unfamiliar. It was only supposed to be temporary, a 2-month recovery stay after a fall that fractured her hip. But life had a way of handing out lessons when you least expected it. and in those 8 weeks, Sienna learned more about life, aging, and herself than she had in the past 20 years. Loneliness, she discovered, was the heaviest burden the elderly carried, not the physical aches or the medications or the memory lapses, but the aching absence of presence, of laughter in the halls, of conversations that mattered, of hugs that lingered. In the first week, she met Mrs. Carson, a gentle widow who hadn't received a visitor in over 3 years. Her children lived in other states, too busy with their own lives to remember the woman who once gave up everything for them. Sienna realized then that the pain of being forgotten was sharper than any broken bone. She had family, but she also knew that silence could grow between people like vines, subtle and strangling. Her second lesson came wrapped in the scent of antiseptic and the distant beep of medical machines. Health is more valuable than money. Sienna had always believed in saving for the future, in budgeting wisely, in making sure she left something behind. But here, amidst residents who had pensions and investments but relied on walkers and oxygen tanks, she saw how quickly life could shift. No amount of wealth could buy a good night's sleep, the ability to walk unaided, or a heart that didn't flutter with fear every time it skipped a beat. She remembered a time she skipped her annual checkup to work overtime. Regret came late. But it came heavy. Material things, she learned, held little meaning. The woman in the room next to hers had once been a collector of fine jewelry. Silk scarves, imported china, now those treasures sat in boxes under her bed, untouched. They used to make me feel special, the woman whispered one night. Now they just remind me of a life that's no longer mine. Sienna understood. The things she once prized, her crystal glassware, the antique writing desk, her neatly pressed wardrobe, meant little when her hands trembled too much to write, or when meals were served in plastic trays. What mattered more were the photos of her grandchildren, the worn book of poems her late husband gave her, and the soft cardigan that still smelled faintly of lavender. Perhaps the most humbling lesson was about independence. She had always fought to do everything herself, to be the helper, not the one who needed help. But age had a way of softening pride. One afternoon, as she tried to put on her shoes alone, a kind aide named Joy gently knelt beside her and said, "Let me help. That's what I'm here for." Sienna blinked back tears, not from shame, but from the warmth of being cared for without judgment. She learned that accepting help didn't mean weakness, it meant wisdom. It meant understanding that sometimes, strength was in allowing others to carry your load, even for just a little while. Happiness, she found, was not a grand destination. It lived in small, fleeting moments. The sound of birds outside her window in the morning, a fresh cup of coffee delivered by a smiling staff member who remembered how she liked it, the feel of sun on her skin during afternoon walks, a game of cards that ended in laughter, conversations about nothing and everything with her roommate, Edith, who reminded her of her childhood best friend. In those moments, she didn't feel old or forgotten, she felt alive. She also discovered that forgiveness brought peace. One evening, lying in bed while the wind tapped gently at her window, Sienna thought of her eldest daughter, with whom she hadn't spoken in 6 years after a bitter argument about a will and family heirlooms. That night, Sienna wrote a letter, not to reopen wounds, but to close them. "I'm sorry for the things I said. I love you, no matter what." She left it in her bedside drawer, not knowing if it would ever be sent, but feeling lighter for having written it. She began to understand that every day, no matter how ordinary or quiet, was a gift. At her age, she had seen friends pass away, neighbors move into memory care, and family move on. She learned to savor each sunrise, each breath, each moment of lucidity. She stopped rushing through the day and started noticing the softness of time. It was no longer about chasing the future, but honoring the present. And finally, the most painful truth of all, time was not limitless. The greatest waste wasn't money or opportunity, it was time itself. Time spent worrying, time spent bitter, time spent trying to control things she couldn't. Sitting in her chair by the window, watching the world move gently outside, Sienna realized that the real tragedy was not growing old, but growing old without truly living. When she left the nursing home after those 2 months, cane in hand and heart full of wisdom, she didn't just walk out as a recovering patient. She walked out as a woman transformed. Her steps were slower, but her soul was lighter. She had learned that even in places of quiet sorrow, there were lessons waiting to bloom, and she would carry those lessons with her, for however many days she had left. Sienna stood in the quiet of her mother's dimly lit room, the soft hum of the oxygen machine the only sound breaking the stillness. She was 72, And though the years had been kind to her spirit, they had carved delicate lines across her face. Over the past year, she had begun to notice subtle but haunting changes in her mother, things no one else seemed to see. Or perhaps, chose not to. It started with the weight loss. Gradual at first, brushed off as part of aging. But now her mother's once plump hands were thin and fragile, her wedding band slipping past the knuckle. The fatigue had followed, the kind that wasn't cured by sleep. She would sit by the window, staring outside for hours, no longer interested in her garden or the books she once devoured. Then came the confusion, forgetting dates, mistaking names, a flicker of panic in her eyes when she couldn't recognize her own reflection in the hallway mirror. Sienna tried to reason with it, to believe it was nothing. But deep down, she knew, something in her mother's spirit was dimming. The signs kept coming, infections that lingered longer than they should, bruises from slight bumps, sleep that became restless and disjointed. And perhaps most painful of all was her mother's voice, once lively and rich, growing quieter. As though she were retreating inward, the woman who had once held the family together now barely had the strength to hold a teacup. But it was more than physical decline. There was a spiritual retreat happening. A slow and steady goodbye that had no date, no warning, only presence. Sienna's siblings told her she was imagining it, that their mother was just tired. But Sienna had been there every day, through the nights of shallow breathing. The mornings where her mother stared at her like she was a stranger. The afternoons when her once sharp mind drifted into silence. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, almost invisible unless you looked closely. But Sienna had always seen her mother with clarity. And now she saw the truth. Her mother was likely entering her final year. It was a knowledge that wrapped itself around Sienna's heart with both sorrow and grace. She didn't waste time fighting it. Instead, she leaned into it, taking her mother's hand every chance she got. Playing her favorite music, brushing her hair with slow, gentle strokes, whispering stories from the past they once lived together. She brought her mother's old friends by for visits. Even if conversation was minimal, she filled the room with light and warmth. Because if this was the last stretch of the journey, Sienna would make sure it was traveled in dignity and love. She didn't fear the end anymore. She feared her mother leaving this world without knowing how deeply she was loved. So every day, Sienna stayed present, watching, listening, loving, until the time came, and when it did, she would be ready, with open arms and an open heart. One of the most profound lessons drawn from the content is the quiet power of awareness, presence, and emotional preparedness when facing the slow decline of a loved one. In our later years, we often become witnesses to the fragility of life, not just in others, but in ourselves. Recognizing subtle signs of change, weight loss, fatigue, disorientation, emotional withdrawal, is not about fearing the end, but honoring the sacredness of time left. Aging is not just about physical deterioration, it is about letting go, softening into stillness, and often, saying goodbye in small, invisible ways. For an older audience, this reminds us that love isn't always loud. It is in showing up daily, offering patience when memory fades, and choosing dignity over denial. The end of life should not be met with panic, but with presence, and those who remain must carry the responsibility of making those final moments meaningful. The lesson is clear: cherish the now, pay attention, and don't wait for dramatic signs to express love or prepare your heart. Often, the most important goodbyes happen long before the final breath.